In the previous video, I suggested we think of the mind as a representational system and proposed 4 different conditions for a theory of representation. But you may be wondering why representation is a good way of understanding what the mind is. Maybe something more like consciousness or rationality or emotion is a better way to think about a mind. And I think that the answer to the question of why representation is that representation is a more basic idea that can also account for these other features of a mind. This series focuses on how representation determines meaning, because humans tend to attribute meaning to all kinds of things, to artificial intelligence, the universe, even a pair of lucky socks. And it's important to think about how meaning works. Otherwise, we get confused and start thinking that the luck is in the socks instead of in the person wearing them. So how does representation determine meaning? Let's go back to Descartes and his idea that the mind is a thing that thinks. If you know anything about Descartes, you know that he imagined that his world and the body could all be an illusion, and concluded that the mind was the only thing that exists. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes' dualism was a consequence of the split between knowing the mind with certainty and the possibility that the body and everything else could just be an illusion. Edmund Husserl, a philosopher in the 20th century, updated Descartes' idea by arguing that you're more than just a bare cogito. When you're thinking of something. In other words, thinking is representational. Even if you imagine that the world and your body are all an illusion, you're imagining that there's something that's there that's illusory. And as Husserl says, this imagination, and I quote, includes the whole stream of experienced life and all its particulars, the appearances of objects, other people, cultural situations, etc. Nothing changes, except that I no longer accept the world as simply real. I no longer judge regarding the distinction between reality and appearance. This move is called the phenomenological epoche. We start by withholding judgment about the metaphysical nature of objects, whether they're reality or appearance. He refers to this as bracketing judgment about the world. By beginning this way, we recognize the essential relation between objects and our experiences. In keeping with Descartes, he uses fancy Latin terms to talk about what we talked about in terms of the vehicle of representation and its object. He talks about them as cogito and cogitatum. So what is a cogitatum? What does Husserl say about objects, the objects of consciousness, the things that we're conscious of? And here's an example of him talking about a hexahedron, which is a cube. And this isn't a cube, but it has some nice shiny bits that will help me illustrate what I want to get at in talking about the phenomenological epoche and how it allows us to examine our experiences to determine what's out there in the world. So the phenomenological epoche has 3 steps. You start by bracketing your assumptions about the nature of the world. So when you're having experiences, you can look around and you will see objects in the world. You'll see me, your screen, whatever else is in your environment is there. It appears in your experience. And so what you want to do is bracket what that is. Is that a feature of your mind? Maybe you're dreaming. Maybe it's an illusion. Is it a feature of the physical world that has an external reality independent of your mind? Don't worry about that. Just bracket your assumption about that. So we're just starting with your experiences, and then the second step is to look at those, to pay attention to the things themselves, as he calls them. The things themselves aren't the objects, they're the appearances of the objects that appear in your experience. And then the third step is to determine what is essential. What features of the experience make it the experience that it is. So maybe it has particular color, particular shape. Again, we'll look at the hexahedron and see what Husserl says that we should do in terms of looking at the objects of our experience. For example, if I consider the perception of a hexahedron, then I notice in pure reflection that the hexahedron is given as a continuous and unitary object, together with a many-formed and determinate manifold of modes of appearance. It is the same hexahedron, the same Kleenex box, the same appearance, regardless of whether viewed from this side or that one, from this or that perspective, from close or from far, with greater or lesser distinctness and determinateness. I can put it up here and it's kind of really fuzzy. Maybe it's more distinct back here. Nonetheless, if we see any hexahedral surface, any edge or corner, any spot of color, in short, any aspect of the objective sense, then we notice the same thing in every case. It is the unity of a manifold with constantly changing modes of appearance, a unity of its particular perspectives and of the particular differentiations of the subjective here and there. So we're looking at this and we see that there are lots of different edges and shapes and colors as it, moves about. But there's a kind of manifold, a kind of unity of this object that holds it together as an object in our experience. If we look uncritically, we find a color that is always identical and unchanging. It seems like it's just kind of black. But if we reflect on the mode in which it appears, we recognize that the color is nothing other, nor can it be thought as anything other than that which presents itself now as this and now it's that shade. So if you're really paying attention, instead of just sort of saying that's black, that's a black Kleenex box, you can see that you've got this shade and this shade over here, and that there are all sorts of different kinds of aspects of the box as you move it around. And it's constantly shifting and changing. Unity is always unity of representations, which is the representation of the spontaneous presentation of color or the presentation of an edge. So we've got all of these different aspects of this box that are moving about, and the unity is a unity of representation. It's my mind that is representing these little different kinds of colors and edges as one Kleenex box. So this box forms a unity of representations, and one of the key features that determines its unity is time, that it has a kind of consistency over time. There are lots of changes, but various ways in which I interact with this set of appearances is consistent over the course of time. And this is a way that Husserl says we can distinguish between a real object and, for example, a dream object. So this object maintains itself. I can hide it and bring it back. I can drop it. I can, throw it in the air. There are all kinds of ways that I can manipulate this object in the real world that allow it, that when I do those things, it maintains its consistency and expectations as a box. Whereas if this were a dream box, all kinds of things could happen. It could turn into a doorway that you walk through. It could turn into a giraffe. It could disappear entirely. Dream boxes are unreliable. They do all kinds of things. And so that is how I can distinguish between a dream box and a real box, just by looking at my appearances, at how this box appears to me in my experience. This way of paying attention to the appearances of things is really useful in thinking about how our minds work. In particular, it can provide some insight into how we come to represent things. As adults, we take our visual perception for granted and immediately recognize tables and chairs and cups and Kleenex boxes just at a glance. Many sounds and smells and tastes are also recognizable. But vision has a way of organizing the world into an array of distinct objects that appear independent of our perception of them. Husserl reminds us that this way of seeing the world is an achievement. If we really pay attention to our experience, we'll notice that the Kleenex box or other objects have a variety of colors and shapes as they move around in space. And it can be a shock then to realize that the obviously white and gold dress appears as blue and black to somebody else. We wonder, how is this possible? Isn't the world just the way it is out there, and we all see the world in the same way? I mean, after all, we all talk about Kleenex boxes and dresses and so forth, and you say, this is my red shirt, and everybody, please get me that red shirt, and people will go and get that. So it seems like we're all in a world that's independent of us, and that it has these features of color and shape and so forth independently of our perception of them. So it can be a shock when there are disagreements about how things appear. And so how is this possible? And the answer I've been developing is that the mind is a representational system. Your perceptions differ from another person's perceptions because you're representing the world in a different way. Why and how you manage to represent things in the way you do is a question that a theory of representation ought to be able to answer. And I think there are answers. If you Google the blue and gold dress, you'll see how vision scientists articulate why people have fundamental disagreements on what the colors are and how color perception works. That's a scientific kind of explanation, but there's a philosophical question of, well, why is it fundamentally that we represent things, and what fundamentally is the relationship between our systems of representation and the things we're representing? So this is the question that we're getting at here, to try to figure out what a mind is such that it represents in the way that it does. Husserl offers an internalist theory of representation. The mind is given sets of appearances. That's the given, that's the things in themselves, these sets of appearances. And he calls them phenomena. And the theory is phenomenology. That's the study of the phenomena, study of appearances. Patterns in these phenomena reveal their essences. That's the third step of identifying the essences in the patterns. And the mind is responsible for identifying the essences in those patterns of appearances. My mind is representing this set of appearances as a box, as a cube. And that's because it's determined that the pattern of edges and colors satisfies the essential features of a cube. The direction of explanation for an internalist is from mind to its contents, from cogito to cogitatum. And the advantage of this view is that it solves the problem of dualism. Mind and body are not separate. Bodies are contents of the mind. But several other problems appear. The nature of both mind and body is unclear. The mind is whatever is representing things, but what exactly is that? How is the mind related to a brain, for example? Are they the same thing? Could anything be a mind? Could anything do representation? And if anything could do representation, does the box represent me? Is that possible? And then what about bodies? The cube is the pattern of appearances that appears to be real rather than a dream, but does it actually exist independent of my mind? Or does it just appear to be independent of my mind because that's the pattern of appearances that appears to me? Could it be just appearances and there be no thing, no actual box independent of how things are appearing to me? And that raises the even more important question of whether you exist independently of me. Or are you just an appearance? Or all people just appearances? Is the world just my appearances? So it's an advance over Descartes in that it's not just my mind. I also get the world. It's given in appearances. But is it just my world? This view known as solipsism, and most of us feel that that would be kind of lonely, that we wouldn't want to be solipsists. And so Husserl and other people who follow this view of thinking about representation have this problem of making an argument that there is actually a world and other people in that world that we share, that it's not just a world of appearances. Finally, there's the question of how a mind determines the essences of things. Cubes are pretty straightforward, but what about more fuzzy sorts of things like the species of a tree? Philosopher Hilary Putnam famously couldn't distinguish between an elm and a beech tree. And Husserl might say that Putnam just failed to pay proper attention to the essential features of the elm tree and the beech tree, that if he did, that he could distinguish them. But what's Putnam supposed to do in the meantime? When he sees a tree, does he see an elm tree? Does he see a beech tree? Does he see some indeterminate non-species tree? What is he representing? What is his mind doing in the absence of capacity to identify the essence of one tree relative to the essence of the other tree? It seems there should be answers to all of these sorts of questions, and it's not clear how the internalist, in particular the phenomenologist like Husserl, is able to answer them. Still, there's a lot to recommend this view. It satisfies the fundamental Cartesian intuition that the mind is special. It's a foundational form of existence. It's not just that we know about the world by using our minds, it's that the world in some sense depends on having a mind. And so think about whether you share this Cartesian intuition. Does the mind determine what is represented, or does the object have a more fundamental role in shaping your representations? Another way to think about this question is to ask about the relation between object and content. Remember that from the Perner video. We've got the vehicle, we've got the content, and the object, and we need to figure out how they're related to one another. So in thinking about the appearances in relation to the cogitatum in relation to the cogito, you might think about what's the relation between the content of your representation of the box and the object itself, the box. Are the contents of representation sufficient to constitute the box? Is all there is to being a box the fact that I have the set of appearances? Or does the object exist independent of representations and somehow generates them? And if your intuition goes in that direction, then you're more of a naturalist than an internalist, but then you need to say sort of how the object might manage to do something like generate a representation, and what sort of thing is a mind such that the object can generate representations for it. Arguably, the box doesn't generate representations for the wall or other books or anything. It just does it for my mind. And how does that happen if it is the box that's doing some work?